All right, so it's my understanding that we have been on a long march through the 12 minor prophets. And that's not something that happens quickly. When you move through the 12 minor prophets, it's going to take a minimum of 12 weeks, and that's just for the most cursory overview of any one of the prophets. So since we've been at it for a little while, before we start into our study today, which is Habakkuk, I would be interested in any questions you have based on what you've heard up to this point. Do you have any questions from your discussions of the prophets that you want to bring up at this time? Okay, I'm going to ask you to take that microphone and ask that question because that is a superior question. Absolutely superior.
My question relates to why we so infrequently study these minor prophets. In the years that I've been a Christian, which is when I was a little kid, I honestly only remember looking at these, and maybe not all of them, 3 times, considering this big book, the Bible.
Right.
That's not much.
So the question is, why is it that one can grow up in our denomination did you grow up a Baptist? Mostly. So how is it that you can grow up in a Baptist church in the United States and only hear in the course of a lifetime maybe 3 times attention to the minor prophets in the Old Testament? So who wants to venture a thesis? Who wants to venture? Well, let me start by this. What is the central message of the minor prophets? What's the topic that will come up most readily? Let me read a passage to you that I think summarizes. If I can find it. Here we go. With what shall I come to the Lord and bow myself before the God on high? Shall I come to him with burnt offerings, with yearling calves? Does the Lord take delight in thousands of rams or 10,000 rivers of oil? Remember, this is one of the minor prophets, Micah. Shall I present my firstborn for my rebellious acts, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O man, what is good. Let me say that again. He has told you, God has told you what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Now that, quite frankly, summarizes one of the central themes of the minor prophets. 12 books of the Old Testament. Core concern is our rebellion insofar as we're unwilling to address the question of justice. Justice is one of the key attributes of God. And yet, as Baptists, we have minimized that attribute of God so severely over the course of my lifetime, at least, that I cannot remember having spent every Sunday in Sunday school from the time I was 5 years old. No, that's not true. From the time before I was born, we never talked about justice. And we never talked about God's justice. Ever. I didn't learn about it until I was in seminary. So then the question becomes, why? Why is it that Baptists are so reluctant to attend to God's, one of his primary attributes of justice?
Oh, excuse me. I was just thinking because we're not just. I mean, we're unjust. We don't want to
That's right.
look at ourselves.
We ourselves. And what is it we might not have to look at?
Well, I was just thinking how we treat others.
You're on it. You're absolutely on it. Keep
And
going.
a lot of American Christianity is really focused on our individual selves and not on systemic issues. And so, you know, if you just turn all of your faith focus inward and just look at yourself, you don't have to look at the ways in which you and your church and your community are operating in systemic ways that are unjust.
All you guys are really on it. That's right. Keep going. So what defined much of this country's social and economic reality? Slavery. In this part of the world, from 1619 until 1865. And then after 1865, during Reconstruction, the country suffered a deconstruction that led to Jim Crow. And much of what counted as Jim Crow, which lasted for 100 years, was not addressed in the law until the 1960s. And then since the 1960s, there has been significant progress. But of course, not without consequences of that history. Well, it's hard to talk about justice in Sunday school under those circumstances. In other words, the cultural pressure not to look at something that's staring you in the face is profound. And when you read about what's going on in the time of the minor prophets, remember, and just to go back and rehearse this, I know this is probably the zillionth time I've said this, or Daniel said it, but we're living in a period of the prophets where they're facing tremendous external pressure from empires. You know, they're a little country. Israel and Judah are little countries in between giant empires. Assyria, Babylon, Egypt. And those pressures create two phenomena that cause God's people to turn away. One is they worship Yahweh. The powers, the great powers, do not. And so for anyone who is interested in getting on in the world are going to have to accommodate those powers. And it's usually the people who are in power who make those accommodations to other gods in relation to those other powers. It's the influence of those powers. Secondly, the people who are in power of the small countries, Judah and Israel, want to stay in power. So if you want to stay in power, you have to accommodate the interest of the empire, which means you often have to oppress the people below you to ensure that you can do what the people outside of your country want you to do. And so you create these systems, these cycles of great hardship and oppression on the people from the bottom. And what happens to the people at the bottom from time to time? They rebel. They revolt. Now, the scenario I've just identified, you can move it all the way up 600 years to Jesus' day. Exact same phenomenon. The empires, which in that time was either Greece or Rome. In Jesus' day it was Rome, but just before Jesus it was Greece, or the Greeks. Greek culture and Greek power. But then you have the Romans. Same phenomenon. But we're talking about the minor prophets and why we've never spent much time with them in church, in Baptist churches in North America. It's because, as Kathy has suggested, we don't want to look at ourselves. Because you can't read this stuff and not figure out pretty quickly that the way things are organized isn't good, isn't right, that someone's getting short shrift in your culture or society. Or to at least ask the question, who is, and are we concerned for them? And so, like I said, I never heard anybody talk about justice until I was in my early 20s. And that was when I went to seminary. It just never came up. So here we are, a little bit of Micah, and I think have you done Micah already? I think you've done Micah. So now we're in Habakkuk, right? And Habakkuk, Habakkuk he's right after Nahum. Habakkuk is a little hard for us because we don't know much about Habakkuk. The book itself doesn't give us a lot of biographical details on Habakkuk. But what we do know is that he proclaims several oracles, several prophecies, and has a long poem at the end, or a long prayer, however you want to characterize it. But let me read what, a lot of our Bibles have these little summary paragraphs. Let me read what the summary paragraph says here. It says, Habakkuk was written as a dialogue or conversation between God and the prophet. He saw that the leaders were oppressing the poor. What did we just talk about? He saw that the leaders were oppressing the poor. How many times does Jesus talk about the poor? You read the Gospel of Luke. It's like one of the central themes of Jesus' ministry. That the leaders were oppressing the poor, so he asked why God, this is what makes Habakkuk interesting, okay? He asked why God allowed the wicked to prosper. Right? We're going to get to that here in a minute. But that's the question of Habakkuk. Why, oh God? Because this isn't between Habakkuk and the leaders. This is between Habakkuk and God. God, why do you allow the wicked to prosper? Having received replies, he responds with a beautiful confession of faith. His confession became a public expression and appears to have been used as a psalm. So, let me just read the first part of this. Habakkuk is taken to be written around the end of the 7th century BCE, okay? So we're talking about, it says the Chaldeans, right? Who are the Chaldeans? The Chaldeans are the Babylonians. So we've already had the rise and somewhat decline of the Assyrian Empire further west. But now southeast is the rise of the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. And as they're rising, the things we've already just talked about are beginning to be very, very much a problem. Israel, the kingdom of Israel, is gone. Why? Because the Assyrians destroyed it. Took everybody away, destroyed it, made slaves out of a bunch of them, killed a bunch of them, and then subjugated the rest. Well, here comes the Babylonians defeating the Assyrians. And what do you get as a prize? You get the land bridge between Asia and Africa. And so now there's a lot of pressure on Judah. And so here are the leaders doing the things to accommodate the pressure from the Babylonians and putting tremendous oppressive practices on the poor. And so let me read this. This is Habakkuk talking to God. How long, O Lord, will I call for help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you, violence, and yet you do not save. Why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are before me. Strife exists and contention arises. Therefore, the law is ignored and justice is never upheld. For the wicked surrounded the righteous. Therefore, justice comes out perverted. Look among the nations, observe, be astonished, wonder, because I am doing something in your days. You would not believe if you were told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous people, who march throughout the earth to seize dwelling places which are not theirs. They are dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards and keener than wolves in the evening. Their horsemen come galloping, and the horsemen come from afar. They fly like eagles swooping, and all of them come for violence. Their horde of faces moves forward. They collect captives like sand. They mock kings, and rulers are laughing. A laughing matter to them. They laugh at every fortress and heap up rubble and capture it. Then they will sweep through like the wind and pass on, but they will be held guilty, they whose strength is their God. That's pretty grim picture, isn't it, of what's going on? Habakkuk's already got a clear view of what they're facing. He already knows from reports from other places how this is going to go down. And he's crying out to God, why do you let this happen? We're going to get crushed. It's going to be horrific. We would only have to spend 2 days, probably, in Gaza to have a sense of what Habakkuk was crying out. You know, the destruction, the horror, the devastation, the fear, the what do you call it? The presence of infectious diseases, the whole thing, you know, it's just overwhelming to him. And he's crying out to God, why do these things happen? Or better yet, why do you let these things happen? So, the question comes to you. What are we to make of God's seeming reluctance from Habakkuk's perspective? What are we to make of, I mean, the technical term for what we're talking about is, what are we to make of the problem of evil in the world? It's on. Okay. You just cut it off. There you go. Good.
I think you ended, at least in my Living Word Bible.
Yeah.
the verse before, I think this is the answer, where he says, we are wicked, but they are far more. Will you, who cannot allow sin in any form, stand idly by while they swallow us up?
Right.
So it's like, is it half a dozen or is it 6? Where there's wickedness going on here.
Right.
Wickedness. So
Right.
which is worse?
Right. So, that's an excellent answer. So what it appears is going on is that God uses wickedness to punish wickedness. And that seems to hold up in the other minor prophets. Because as you'll remember, this is one of the beautiful things, one of the rare things in Jewish literature, in Hebrew literature. They're one of the few people who are willing to acknowledge that we're wicked. You know, we always want to point the finger and say, no, you're wicked. No, they say over and over again, the prophets do, that, nope, the reason this is happening to us is because of our own failure to pay attention to what God has asked of us. What did we just hear from Micah? Our failure to pay attention to the wickedness we are complicit in. And so Habakkuk is pointing to, or in his dialogue with God, is asking God, why is it that all this violence has to happen? But the supposition is, what's at the bottom of it is, there's wickedness in the world, and God is going to deal with that through wickedness. Allow that to have a refining capacity or power over Judah. Other comments? Yes.
Well, you mentioned Gaza is the same thing's going on in southern Ukraine, and of course,
Can you imagine?
what happened in Syria for years?
For
was
years.
totally,
Right.
total destruction.
Just imagine that you're living in the United States in 1861, somewhere on the border states, you know, between North and South, where families are being divided through the war, and the sheer carnage. I think Tim will probably have a better idea than I do, but I think the Crimean War was the first time we saw what we might now call modern weapons used effectively. I mean, the Crimean War was just terrible, and those same kinds of weapons were used in the Civil War. And we just saw horrific numbers of people being killed and families divided on both sides of the conflict. And it was, you know, people used really dramatic language to characterize, you know, blood just running in the fields. It was horrific. The disease, the loss to families, crops. You know, the Shenandoah Valley was a breadbasket for the entire eastern seaboard. And, you know, it's devastated by war. Both North and South, institutions destroyed. It just goes on and on and on. And it's like that in these places. That's what they're facing, is that level of devastation. I don't know. I grew up in a place where it wasn't uncommon for folks to still think through their identity as those who will rise again. I mean, it was said in kind of jest, but you know, you had a strong sense of your Southern identity, and you traded on that, and it was true. My upbringing, there are lots of folks all around me for whom that was just the way we thought and talked. But because, and now I'm talking about 100 years later, people are still using language and phrases that essentially came out of an attempt to contend with all that suffering. You know, how do I understand myself and what that was about and who I am in the wake of this horror that the country suffered. The whole country suffered it. And so Habakkuk sees this coming as a prophet. And he's not talking to anybody but God here. He wants to know, God, why are you letting this happen? Now, there are other contexts where we ask that question, not just in terms of, you might say, conflict between nation states or groups. There are other things that happen in life where we ask that question. You know, why, God, do you let this happen? And how do we respond? Or how do you think about what it means to ask that God that question? How is it that things are as they are?
I was thinking on October the 7th, there was probably many Jewish people that were asking God, why did you let this happen? Why did you let Hamas come in here and rape and plunder and kill and slaughter our people like that? So they're still asking probably, but they're doing something to try to keep that from happening again.
So not only did they ask the question, the Palestinian Christians were asking that question, and the Muslims were asking that question. Why? I mean, each of them were asking God, why? And the point is that, you know, when violence erupts in the world, it's very natural to ask God why. You know, I think of families that have lost loved ones through gun violence. I think of families who lose loved ones through rare diseases, particularly if it takes someone from your community or your family when they're young. These kinds of questions are very much with us in life. And Habakkuk wants to know the answer. So let me share with you chapter 2, one of the answers. I will stand on my guard and station myself on the rampart, and I will keep watch to see what he will speak to me and how I may reply when I am reproved. And then the Lord said to me, record the vision and inscribe it on tablets, that the one who reads it may run. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It hastens towards the goal, and it will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it will certainly come. It will not delay. Behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live by his faith. Furthermore, wine betrays the haughty man, so that he does not stay at home. He enlarges his appetite like Sheol. He is like death, never satisfied. He also gathers to himself all nations and collects himself all peoples. Will not all of these take up a taught song against him, even mockery and insinuations against him, and say, woe to him who increases what is not his? For how long? And makes himself rich with loans. Will not your creditors rise up suddenly, and those who collect from you awaken? Indeed, you will become plunder for them, because you have looted many nations. All the remainder of the peoples will loot you, because of human bloodshed and violence done into the land, to the town and all its inhabitants. I mean, notice Habakkuk's drawing our attention to the exploitation that became rife in the country. Rife. Who to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high and to be delivered from the hand of calamity? You have devised a shameful thing for your house. In other words, you've been scheming to cut yourself off so you don't have to. In other words, you're going to accommodate oppression in order to preserve your position in society. You have devised a shameful thing for your house by cutting off many people, and so you are sinning against yourself. Surely the stone will cry out from the wall, and the rafter will answer it from the framework. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence. Woe to anyone who founds a town with violence. Is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples toil for fire, and nations grow weary for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So, one of the things that Habakkuk is trying or is hearing from God's reply, and this is always true, I think, when we're talking about what God is doing, that God is going to use the chaos and evil that's in the world to chasten and bring into order those things that are out of order. Now, hear me well. God's not causing the violence, but God will act in the midst of it to work towards the things that he wants. He will use it to chastise us or to winnow us, to refine us. Now, that may sound like a shocking proposition, but what would it mean to acknowledge that? Because the unquestioned assumption in this is that both Judah and the Babylonians are responsible for their wickedness. But God is going to overcome that wickedness through how he's going to chastise us for that wickedness. I don't know if that makes any sense. Any comments or questions? Yeah.
I'm still relating this to the current day. So, I mean, October the 7th, again, why did that happen? Is the Jewish community, were they sinful? Were they, all the bad things that Habakkuk said that they were they wicked? No, they were just doing their normal, nice activities, weren't they?
Yeah, that's probably where you would get a lot of disagreement from Habakkuk.
That's what I want to know.
Yeah, Habakkuk would tell you that both sides of that conflict
Are evil?
are both perpetrating evil on each other. And God's going to
Or was the
use...
Jews?
I'm
Oh,
sorry?
you mean because of the Palestine and living in Gaza and all that stuff?
Well, it goes much, much farther than that. As you know, we rehearsed a long history of how there's been recrimination on both sides. And what's the key to that recrimination? Violence. And what's the point of the violence? To put down the other side. And that's precisely, remember, we talked about this some months ago. Jesus is approaching Jerusalem, and he's weeping. And he says, if they had known what makes for peace. So what's happening, the dynamics in Jesus' day, very similar. You've got Rome and Pilate. Pilate's in the city. Why is he there? To ensure that nothing gets out of hand. You've got the leaders of the city and Judaism, what are they doing? They're accommodating Rome in order to maintain their positions of power. What are the people doing? They're rebelling against the oppression perpetrated by their own leaders, so that because their leaders are oppressing them so that they can stay in power relative to Rome. And the whole system, the whole complex of relationships is supported by violence. Any group you look at, each one of them is using violence as the way to get things done. And Jesus said, if they'd only known what makes for peace, he's weeping. So, my point is that this is a horrible way to put things. And I don't want you to think this is my perspective, but I'm just using it because I've heard it said by certain leaders at different times about different conflicts. Quote, it will eventually burn itself out. You remember the Serbian conflict in what used to be Yugoslavia? You know, I mean, it was ugly. And I remember folks using the expression, maybe we should let the situation burn itself out. Others might say of what's going on in the Ukraine, we just need to let it burn itself out and then we'll have peace. Well, that's the cessation of violence is not peace. In other words, we'll just let them kill each other till they're exhausted and call it a day and say we're good. But Habakkuk is asking God, why are you letting all of this happen? And God's response is, look, a time's coming. And I'm going to change things because of this. I'm going to use your choices to reverse the world you live in. But as long as you go this way, these are the results you're going to have. And so what we see is an invitation by Habakkuk for people to recognize that God's way is not the world's way. And as soon as they grasp that God's way is not the world's way, you have the seeds of the possibility of profound change. But that's hard to win, as we know. Now, you see eruptions of it all throughout history of where God's way begins to win and things change. You see it in very small situations, and you see it in large-scale situations. Our task is to listen and see where are we on the Habakkuk scale, so to speak. What are our instincts and our responses to the world being as it is? And how do we respond to that? Just questions or responses. I'm talking way too much here. Come on now. Y'all are really, really thoughtful people. You've got to have questions.
Man's inhumanity to man.
That's my dad's favorite phrase when it comes to this
Well,
stuff.
you know, we're reading about what happened thousands of years ago, and it's still happening. And it will always probably, unless we can get along one-to-one with our neighbor and live together.
Right.
This will never happen. And if somebody always wants power,
Well said.
you know.
Power is
it's-
part of the problem.
it's a
Yes, sir.
problem.
So this is just a confession of my own thinking, right? But I have a real problem with the idea that there is an all-powerful, all-loving God who didn't cause the violence, right? But yet he's going to use the violence to, for whatever his will might be. I just don't like that.
Good. That's good. So, What that's called, that's the traditional problem of evil. You know, we say of God that he's all powerful, all good, all knowing. And if that's true, then evil in the world means either that he's not all good or he's not all powerful, right? That's the argument. Yeah, that's the argument. And the answer oftentimes is free will. However, when you put it that way, it's very misleading. And here's why. When we use the expression God is all powerful, that's not going to work. If by all powerful you mean all the power there is. Because there are things that God can't and won't do. He can't do them. God can't ride a bicycle. God can't eat an ice cream cone. Okay? You know, the demons have, I'm sorry?
He gets stuck in traffic.
Right. He can't suffer that either. In other words, the philosophers have constructed this understanding of the Almighty by calling God all-powerful. And we do call God all-powerful, but what we mean by that is almighty. And what we mean by almighty is not all the power there is. It's all the power that is of a certain kind, namely divine or spiritual or love. You could say it, you could do it by saying love is all powerful. That's one way to help understand it. And when you understand that, you're not talking about some transcendent metaphysical being that has the power to do this, that, and the other, like moving pieces on a chessboard. You know that God's a very different kind of being. God does not engage in quantum mechanics. God acts with authority over creation. And there's a very big difference. God moves things with divine authority, not with causation. And so when we're thinking about the problem of evil, the question is, well, what does it mean for God to engage the world with all power? Or, to put it more accurately, as the Almighty. Or to put it another way, where love has all the power. And that's where Christians point to the cross. From any other scheme, the cross is nonsense. The Apostle Paul tells us it's nonsense. Why? Because the Greeks look at this and you say, this is how God's going to deal with the world? By suffering? That's how we're going to overcome all this? Through suffering? That's the answer? Yes. When love meets the world, it suffers. When love challenges violence, it suffers. When love contends with evil, it suffers. But don't think for a minute that that's not a form of overcoming. It's the most profound form of overcoming. Because you can't hurt love. If it's love, you're not going to break it. It's precisely love that undermines the violence or the self-interest or the power or the hatred. You think about some of the most extraordinary moments. I often think of Mother Emanuel Church, where the young man went in and shot up a whole Sunday school class of people. And that church found a way to forgive that young man, to love him despite his evil actions, his violence against them, that they were able to love. They met that with love. It was profound, remarkable, almost overwhelming to watch. They had every reason to hate or to strike out. And yet somehow they found the resources to meet that with love. And I think that's where the prophets are headed. And don't forget, Jesus was considered a prophet. I mean, he's in that tradition of saying the things that the prophets said, often quoted, both by Jesus and Paul. And when we frame up what God's up to, we see that, well, it's what? Well, it's like the ministry of Jesus, where every kind of violence is imagined against him, where every kind of denigration is perpetrated against him, where whole communities are irate at the things he's doing. Remember, every time he would do ministry somewhere, he'd have to move or move on. Why? Because it upsets people when you love the unlovable. It makes people mad. You're like, that's not possible. Oh, yeah. You feed 5,000 people on a Saturday afternoon. What do you think the local merchants are going to say about that? They're going to have a lot to say to whoever's in charge in town. And what's the guy in charge going to do? He's going to go make sure that these people are run out of town who keep feeding people for free. That's the point. Nobody came in to get a Slim Jim. Nobody came in to buy any jerky. Nobody came in to buy any, my favorite, potted meat. Oh, that's horrible, isn't it? I'm sorry, I shouldn't have brought that up. Vienna sausages, potato chips, turkey sandwiches, or my favorite, Gatorade. Nobody bought any Gatorade that day. Not good. If you don't believe me, read the book of Acts. These apostles show up in towns, they start doing stuff, and it tanks the exploitation of the economy because they start doing things differently. And they get upset and they throw Paul in jail. And so it's a very particular kind of power, is the best way to put it. It's a kind of power that we always hear power as coercive, but it's the exact opposite. It's not coercive power. It's a kind of power that overcomes as love. Now, I apologize. We're out of time. But anyway, these themes will come back and we'll discuss them as time goes on. Yes, Bonnie?
Surely you're going to end with a message of hope.
Oh.
After chapter 2 talks about greed and stealing and
Yes.
tyranny and drunkenness and immoral
Immoralities
living and
of all
adultery
kinds.
and everything, then we get to 2:20.
Yep.
The little word but.
But, yep.
We've gone through all this, and the
2:20.
Bible says, but
The Lord,
is in his holy temple.
bleh.
Let all the earth be silent before him. I need to
Absolutely.
leave with hope.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I got lost in the problem of evil, but you're absolutely right. But that is the hope. You know, that out of this, God can work love. Paul uses this language. You intended these things for evil, but I'm going to turn them